The old disappearance reports surfaced the way rot comes through paint, quietly. After years of being sealed, I wasn't assigned to them at first. They arrived in my inbox as part of a routine digitization backlog. Cases older than my badge, names typed on paper so thin it felt like skin. What struck me wasn't the number of missing persons, but the sameness of the errors. Dates that contradicted one another by days, sometimes by decades. Search grids that overlapped places the victims had never visited. Witness statements stamped as taken before the witnesses were officially interviewed. In several files, photographs were mislabeled, showing landmarks that should not have existed at the time. New trail signs, altered rock formations, entire ridgelines shifted by a few degrees. At first, I blamed clerical negligence, the human sloppiness that accumulates in cold cases, but the patterns repeated too cleanly. Every report tied back to the same general region near the park boundary, near the canyon, near a space the maps refused to name, in margins, in pencil. Someone had written questions instead of notes. Why was the weather wrong? Why did the clocks stop? Why did they all say the same thing before contact was lost? That the air felt older than it should have been. The canyon's proximity stopped being a footnote once I started laying the reports side by side. It wasn't just nearby. It was persistent, hovering at the edge of every map, every timeline, every last known coordinate. Victims vanished on trails that curved toward it. Campsites pitched within sight of its rim. Patrol routes that should have stayed miles away, but somehow drifted closer with each revision. The canyon itself resisted documentation. Elevation readings disagreed by hundreds of feet. Aerial surveys flattened it, then deepened it. Depending on the year, rangers described the same overlook with incompatible details, as if they had stood in different places using the same name. When I visited in person, the distance felt wrong. Sound carried too far. Then, not at all. Wind rose from below without touching the rim. I understood then why the cases felt unfinished. The canyon wasn't a backdrop. It was an influence, a gravity well pulling events toward it, bending procedure and memory alike, standing there. I had the uneasy sense that the disappearances hadn't happened near the canyon. They had happened because of it. Nighttime audio anomalies began subtly, the way fatigue imitates malfunction. During late shifts, when the building emptied and only the servers hummed, I noticed faint distortions in archived recordings, a drag in the silence between words, a breath where none should be. Dispatch tapes crackled with low-frequency murmurs that didn't register as speech but felt intentional, paced on one recording. A missing hiker's voicemail ended with several seconds of wind that matched no known weather pattern, followed by a single footstep echoing as if in a vast interior space. When I played it again, the step came earlier, another time. It didn't come at all. Body cam audio exhibited similar inconsistencies. Radios answering questions that were never asked. Distant knocks layered beneath routine traffic stops. My own name spoken too softly to be identified, yet too clearly to dismiss. I ran diagnostics. Everything passed, but the anomalies favored certain hours, clustering between midnight and 3. When the canyon lay in complete darkness. I stopped wearing headphones. The sounds felt closer that way, less mediated, as if listening too carefully might invite a response. The discovery of Sector 7's omission came not as a revelation, but as an absence that refused to stay empty. I noticed it while cross-referencing topographical layers, federal maps, Park Service revisions, civilian GPS renders. There was a gap north of Old Faithful, a subtle distortion where contour lines thinned and then simply stopped. 12 square miles reduced to interpolation, the software smoothing over what it could not define. Older paper maps showed something faint beneath the ink, a boxed region scraped away and redrawn until nothing remained but a suggestion of continuity. When I requested internal ranger schematics, the response was delayed, then rerouted, then denied without explanation. One retired surveyor I contacted laughed nervously and said the area never held still long enough to print. No warning symbols, no legends, no restricted markers, just an agreement across every system that nothing worth naming existed there. And yet, every disappearance leaned toward that blank space. It wasn't erased accidentally. It was removed deliberately, as if acknowledging it carried a risk greater than ignorance. Witnesses gave conflicting timelines in ways that resisted reconciliation. It wasn't simple misremembering or the soft drift of trauma. Their accounts disagreed at a structural level. One man insisted the disappearance happened at dusk, under a red sky heavy with clouds. Yet the incident report logged a clear morning with frost still on the ground. A woman described speaking to the missing hiker last winter, though phone records placed the call 3 summers earlier. Dates slipped when pressed, moving backward or forward without the speaker noticing the change. More unsettling were the physical markers. A teenage witness appeared older than his driver's license photo by at least a decade, his posture brittle, his voice worn thin. Another interviewee looked impossibly young for her age, skin smooth, eyes unfocused, as if time had loosened its grip unevenly. When I pointed out the discrepancies, they grew confused, then frightened, insisting the events felt correct even as the numbers failed. Several asked me the same question before leaving, unprompted and old almost in unison. What day is it supposed to be? The Green Journal surfaced during a routine archive pull, misfiled among maintenance logs and wildlife incident reports. It was smaller than expected, its cover a dull institutional green, corners softened by years of handling. No author was listed, no department seal. Inside, the handwriting shifted from entry to entry, sometimes neat, sometimes hurried, as if written under strain. The first pages outlined protocols that didn't exist anywhere else, delays before search and rescue, restrictions on radio use, instructions to avoid reflective surfaces after dusk. Margins were crowded with annotations, corrections layered over earlier rules, arrows pointing backward through paragraphs. One entry described a missing person response that required waiting exactly 72 hours, not for logistical reasons, but because premature recovery increases contamination. Another warned that individuals returning from the zone might appear intact while being chronologically unstable, and the language was clinical, almost apologetic, yet threaded with unease. What unsettled me most was the final page I read that night. Beneath a date scratched out repeatedly was a single line, underlined hard enough to tear the paper. Do not document what notices you first. The GPS data contradicted physical movement so completely that it forced me to question which record was lying. Track logs showed hikers covering miles in seconds, then standing perfectly still for hours, while their heart rate monitors spiked as if they were running uphill. One device traced a clean, methodical path straight through the canyon wall, the signal continuing underground for nearly a mile before resurfacing on the opposite rim. Another split into 3 simultaneous routes, each time-stamped identically, diverging across terrain no human body could traverse in a single lifetime. When compared to boot prints, broken brush, and campsite debris, nothing aligned, The land insisted one story. The satellites told another. Worse, the data rewrote itself. Coordinates I'd bookmarked shifted slightly when reopened. Distances recalculated without explanation. A path that once curved now ran straight. Elevation gained became elevation lost. I stood in the field with a handheld unit, watching my own position jitter several meters back and forth while my feet remained planted. It felt less like an error and more like an argument between systems that could not agree on where or when. I was standing. Aged witnesses unsettled the investigation in a way paperwork never could. It began with photographs, license scans attached to old statements that no longer matched the faces sitting across from me. One man had reported his sister missing 15 years earlier. He now looked closer to 80 than the 52 his records claimed. His hands shook with the fine tremor of advanced age, skin translucent, veins like blue threads pressed close to the surface. He swore he had only been to the canyon once, a few summers back. Yet his medical file listed joint degeneration inconsistent with his stated age. Others showed the opposite effect. A woman who should have been in her 40s appeared barely 30, her voice light, her memories incomplete, as if years had been skimmed away rather than lived. When I asked about the time that had passed since the incident, their answers were vague, emotional instead of numerical. Several admitted they felt older only at night, or younger near running water. One man leaned in close before leaving and whispered that time slipped sideways when the canyon was quiet. I couldn't dismiss it. Their bodies were evidence my training had never prepared me to catalog. The officer's dreams began to mirror the zone with an accuracy that made waking feel like a delay rather than a relief. I dreamed of walking along familiar trails that folded back on themselves, the ground repeating in subtle variations, each pass slightly older, more eroded. The canyon was always present but never directly seen, its depth suggested by sound, the long fall of a stone that never landed, the echo arriving before the throw. In sleep, time behaved differently. Night slid into afternoon without transition. Voices spoke from behind me, using my own cadence, finishing thoughts I hadn't formed yet. I woke with the smell of wet stone in my nose, hands clenched as if gripping rock. Once, I dreamed of reading the green journal, only to find the pages blank until I looked away, the words appearing in my peripheral vision. The most disturbing part was the consistency. These weren't symbolic fragments. They obeyed rules, repeating landmarks, recurring distortions. Each morning, I woke exhausted, with the sense that some part of me had remained behind, standing at the edge of something that knew my name. Entry into Sector 7 happened under paperwork that felt thinner than the air around me. I filed the request as a routine follow-up, burying it beneath enough cross-references to dull scrutiny. The authorization came back stamped and unsigned, approval without ownership. There were no barriers at the boundary, no signs warning me I had crossed into anything different. The change announced itself through sensation. My radio hissed, then fell silent. Though the signal indicator remained full, the temperature dropped unevenly, cold pressing against one side of my body while the other stayed warm. Sound lost its distance. Footsteps echoed before I took them. I checked my watch. The second hand hesitated, stuttered, then resumed. Ahead, the terrain looked ordinary. Pine, stone, rising steam, but it carried a stillness that resisted attention, as if the landscape preferred not to be observed. I marked my position, then hesitated before taking the next step, struck by the irrational certainty that once fully inside, the record of my presence would no longer agree with my memory of it. Sound behaved incorrectly almost immediately, subtle enough at first that I questioned my own attention. The crunch of gravel under my boots lagged behind the motion, arriving a half-second late, then earlier than it should have, as if rehearsing different versions of the same step. Wind moved through the trees without touching them, a low rushing noise with no visible source, while branches swayed in complete silence. When I spoke aloud, my voice returned to me flattened and distant, stripped of direction, impossible to place. At one point, I heard breathing that matched my own rhythm too precisely, until I realized it continued when I held my breath. A metallic tapping echoed from somewhere below the ground, steady and patient. Yet every time I turned toward it, the sound relocated behind me. Radios were useless. Static swelled and receded like surf, occasionally forming shapes that felt almost linguistic before collapsing again. The worst part was the way silence behaved. Not empty, but dense, pressing against my ears with weight. It felt intentional, as if the space itself were listening, adjusting its responses, learning how best to be heard. Landmarks subtly rearranged in ways that discouraged certainty rather than provoking alarm. A boulder I used as a reference point appeared closer each time I passed it. Its lichen pattern rotated just enough to suggest familiarity without confirmation. A stand of dead trees shifted their spacing, trunks leaning inward like a crowd compressing after I walked through. Trail markers remained visible, but disagreed with one another, arrows pointing in directions that should have led back, yet did not. I checked my compass. It behaved politely, spinning only when I wasn't looking directly at it. Even the geysers seemed unsettled, venting steam from vents that hadn't existed minutes earlier, while familiar ones went dormant without warning. None of it happened abruptly. The changes accumulated between glances, during blinks, in the small gaps when attention wavered. I tried to mark my path with survey tape, only to find the knots retied, loops neater than my own work. The landscape wasn't shifting violently. It was editing itself, refining a version where my expectations no longer applied, and where orientation became a suggestion rather than a rule. Disturbing video evidence surfaced late, long after I stopped trusting timestamps. The file came from a recovered phone, its casing warped by heat that hadn't damaged the battery. At first glance, the footage seemed ordinary, 4 figures moving across uneven ground, breath fogging in cold air. Then the synchronization became apparent. Their steps matched perfectly, arms swinging in identical arcs, heads turning at the same intervals without communication. The camera operator lagged behind, yet the others adjusted their pace as if tethered. Shadows misbehaved, stretching in directions inconsistent with the sun's position, sometimes overlapping where bodies did not. As the recording continued, the figures grew translucent, outlines softening until the background bled through them. There was no panic, no struggle. They simply faded, leaving impressions in the grass that persisted after they were gone. The final frames captured the camera falling, rotating slowly, and in the reflection of the cracked lens, I saw movement that did not belong to the person holding it, figures still standing there, just out of face, watching something I couldn't see. Human forms appeared semi-transparent, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual failure of edges. In the footage, and later in my own peripheral vision, bodies lost their solidity in layers. Hands became suggestions, fingers outlined by the absence of light rather than its reflection. Faces held expression without depth. Eyes dark, not from shadow, but from incompleteness. I noticed it first in the way background elements asserted themselves through people, tree lines visible through torsos, steam drifting through shoulders without disturbance. The figures continued to move with purpose, stepping carefully, reacting to terrain that still resisted them. Yet their weight no longer fully registered. Grass bent late beneath their feet. Footprints appeared, then faded before I could count them. When I paused the video, the transparency deepened, as if stillness accelerated the process. Motion preserved cohesion. Observation unraveled it. The most unsettling detail was consistency. Each figure faded at the same rate, as though governed by a shared rule. They weren't dying. They were transitioning into a state where presence no longer required opacity, and where being seen too clearly seemed to hasten their departure. Synchronization replaced individuality so quietly that I didn't recognize the loss at first. In the recordings, and later in the fragments I encountered firsthand, people no longer acted as separate decision-makers. They paused together, turned together, adjusted their pace in unison without signals or cues. Personal habits vanished. A woman who had favored her left leg walked evenly. A man known for restless gestures held his arms still at his sides. Speech, when it occurred, emerged as a single cadence shared across mouths, words overlapping just enough to blur ownership. It wasn't control in the violent sense. There was no visible force. The alignment felt consensual, almost relieving, as if individuality had become a burden too heavy to carry through the zone. I realized then why the disappearances left so little chaos behind. Panic requires separation. Here, that separation dissolved. The group moved as a unit, not because they were commanded to, but because difference introduced friction. In a place where reality strained to remain coherent, sameness was not oppression, it was adaptation, and watching it happen made me fear how easily I might follow. Family history revealed prior involvement the way an old wound reveals itself in cold weather, without invitation. Long after you think it's healed, I found my grandfather's name first, buried in a ranger liaison report from decades earlier. His role described vaguely, his assignments never fully listed. My father followed, referenced in a footnote attached to an incident review that had been quietly closed without conclusion. Neither record accused them of wrongdoing, yet both avoided specifics with the same careful language I had begun to recognize. I went through family belongings that night, opening boxes that hadn't been touched since my mother died. There were photographs I didn't remember being taken. My father standing near a canyon overlook he never spoke about. My grandfather watching something out of frame, his face turned away. In the margins of an old notebook, I recognized handwriting not unlike my own, documenting weather conditions that didn't match the dates. What unsettled me wasn't the implication of secrecy, but familiarity. They hadn't stumbled into the zone by accident. They had been positioned there, generation after generation, as if proximity itself were being inherited, passed down quietly along with names and silence. Genetic tolerance to the zone was never stated outright, but the implication threaded itself through every document I reread and every symptom I failed to experience. Others who entered reported nausea, disorientation, sudden aging, panic attacks that left them unfit for duty. My vitals remained steady, my sense of time bent, but did not fracture. Even after hours inside, I retained enough coherence to document, to remember, to leave. Medical logs from past incidents showed similar patterns attached to familiar surnames. My grandfather's, my father's. Notes remarking on unusual resilience and delayed onset of temporal stress. No conclusions were drawn. Only recommendations to reuse certain personnel when exposure became unavoidable. It felt less like immunity and more like compatibility, as if my nervous system translated the zone's distortions instead of rejecting them. I began to understand why I was still functional, while others scattered, whatever the zone required to interact without immediate collapse. My body supplied it without protest. That realization carried no pride. It felt like learning your blood type matches something you were never meant to transfuse. The officer resisted inevitability the way one resists sleep after a long drive, aware that surrender feels safer, yet certain it will end badly. I told myself patterns only exist because we search for them. That lineage was coincidence, resilience a statistical outlier. I doubled my documentation, cross-checked my memories against recordings, anchored my days to routine, coffee at the same hour, notes written in ink, timestamps verified by 3 clocks. Each step was an assertion that choice still mattered. When the green journal began anticipating my questions, I shut it away. When the zone responded more readily to my presence, I shortened my visits. I refused to consider the logic forming beneath the evidence that I was not approaching a conclusion, but being drawn toward a function. The idea of purpose disturbed me more than the anomalies. Purpose implies design, and design implies consent. I clung to the belief that investigation ends with understanding, not absorption. Yet every act of resistance seemed to refine the path instead of blocking it, as if inevitability was patient, confident that I would eventually exhaust myself arguing with it. He encountered versions of the missing still there, in places that should have been empty. At first, they appeared as distortions at the edge of vision, a silhouette, where heat shimmered, a pause in the steam that suggested a human outline. When I looked directly, nothing remained. Then, one afternoon, near a dried thermal basin, I saw a woman standing where the report said she vanished. She was solid enough to cast a shadow, yet the light passed through her jacket as if it were fog. Her face matched the file photo exactly, unchanged by the years that had passed. She did not react to me, only repeated a small, careful movement, adjusting the strap of a backpack that was no longer on her shoulders. Others appeared nearby, fixed in similar loops, fragments of behavior detached from context. They weren't ghosts, not in the sense I understood. They occupied the space imperfectly, layered over it rather than within it, as if reality had failed to fully release them. I realized then that missing was inaccurate. They hadn't gone anywhere. They had simply fallen out of alignment, still present, still performing echoes of themselves, waiting for something to finish happening. Communication occurred without language in a way that bypassed hearing entirely. Standing near the figures, I felt impressions rather than words, pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest that carried intention without vocabulary. When one of them turned toward me, there was no sound, yet I understood the motion as acknowledgement, not recognition. Meaning arrived whole, unbroken by grammar. Fear was not transmitted, but urgency was, a warning without threat. I sensed directions without being shown paths, outcomes without being told consequences. At times, the exchange felt reciprocal. When I focused on leaving, the figures dimmed slightly, as if relieved. When I lingered, they sharpened, clarity increasing with my attention. It was not thought-sharing, not empathy as I'd known it. It was alignment, a brief overlap where separation wasn't required for understanding. Later, alone, I realized I could no longer recall the content of what had been conveyed, only its weight. The absence of words made it resistant to memory, leaving behind a certainty without explanation, as if something had been agreed upon without ever being spoken aloud. Identity began to blur in increments small enough to escape immediate alarm. It started with pronouns in my notes, sentences written in the passive, then rewritten without a subject at all. I caught myself referring to events without placing myself inside them, as if I had only observed what I knew I had done. My reflection lagged in dark glass, finishing movements after I'd already turned away. In the zone. Memories overlapped. I recalled standing watch at places I had not yet reached, felt fatigue from walks I hadn't taken. Once, reading an old report, I recognized my own phrasing in a statement dated years before my assignment. The fear wasn't that I was losing myself, but that the boundaries defining self were proving negotiable. The missing figures no longer felt entirely separate. Their routines echoed habits I recognized, pauses I favored, routes I would have chosen. I began to understand how individuality thinned here, not through force, but through relevance. In a place where timelines intersected freely, singular identity became inefficient, a temporary arrangement rather than a fixed truth. Future records surfaced bearing my name with a calm inevitability that stripped the moment of shock. The first appeared as a supplemental report attached to a case I hadn't closed yet, authored by me, signed with a version of my signature that felt practiced. Older. The date was wrong by decades. The language was precise, restrained, familiar in ways that unsettled me more than any anomaly. It referenced outcomes I hadn't witnessed, decisions I hadn't made, and locations I hadn't entered, all with the assumption of memory rather than prediction. Subsequent files followed, maintenance requests, radio logs, marginal notes in the Green Journal, each treating my involvement as historical fact. In one, I advised caution around a thermal basin I had not yet discovered. In another, I recommended personnel rotations I would later approve myself. Nowhere did the documents acknowledge their impossibility. They weren't warnings. They were records. Reading them felt less like glimpsing the future and more like realizing I was late to my own past. Stepping into a role already underway, my name moving ahead of me through time with quiet confidence. A temporal collapse was predicted without drama. Buried in language so procedural, it took several readings to register its weight. The phrasing avoided catastrophe, favoring terms like convergence, saturation, threshold failure. According to the projections, timelines within the zone were no longer diverging cleanly. They were folding inward, compressing variation into overlap. Events that should have remained separate were beginning to coincide, sharing space, sound, consequence. The prediction wasn't framed as a sudden end, but as a gradual loss of distinction, past bleeding into future, choice eroding into inevitability. One entry noted that once critical density was reached, containment would no longer be possible through delay or suppression. Reality outside the zone would begin to echo the distortions within it. Small inconsistencies first, then structural ones. The collapse wasn't described as destruction, but as simplification, an erasure of alternate outcomes until only one unstable sequence remained. What unsettled me most was the certainty. No probability ranges, no contingencies. The document treated the collapse as a scheduled condition, already underway, waiting only for the absence of a sufficient anchor to accelerate beyond control. The cost of refusal became clear not through threat, but through accumulation. Each time I delayed, the distortion spread a little farther beyond the zone, A patrol car's dash cam captured overlapping traffic from different hours on the same stretch of road. A witness aged visibly during a single interview, his hair thinning as he searched for words. None of it was dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but together it formed a pattern I could no longer isolate to Sector 7. The future records adjusted accordingly, notes amending timelines to account for unmitigated drift. I understood then that refusal wasn't neutrality. It was absence. Without an anchor, the scattered fragments sought coherence elsewhere, pressing outward into systems unprepared to absorb them. The choice before me was no longer personal. Walking away wouldn't preserve normalcy. It would redistribute the burden. Others would fracture, unconsciously compensating for the stability I withheld. The zone didn't demand sacrifice. It documented consequences. Refusal simply shifted the cost onto anyone unlucky enough to stand near the fault lines as they widened. Quietly, into the world I was trying to protect. The conscious choice to enter the anomaly's center arrived without revelation, stripped of drama by repetition. I had rehearsed it across enough documents, dreams, and projected outcomes that when the moment came, it felt procedural. I secured what records I could, leaving instructions that assumed I would not return in any recognizable way. The path inward did not announce itself. It narrowed instead, landmarks thinning, sound flattening until direction lost meaning. At the center, there was no structure, no light, only a sensation of convergence, like standing where multiple pressures canceled one another out. Time behaved politely there, slowing just enough to allow intention. I understood what was required without being told. Entry was not physical. It was a surrender of sequence, a willingness to exist without insisting on order. I stepped forward anyway, aware that choice itself was the final intact thing I carried with me. The anomaly responded by opening, not a door, but a permission. As I crossed, I felt identity loosen, not violently, but carefully, as if taken apart by something that knew exactly where to begin. Selfhood dispersed across moments the way heat spreads through metal, silently, inevitably, without a clear point of division. I did not vanish. I unfolded. Awareness separated into strands, each tethered to a different instant, a different version of presence. I stood at the canyon rim and deep within it simultaneously, felt cold air on my skin, while also remembering the warmth of offices I would never return to. Thoughts no longer followed sequence. They layered, coexisted. I perceived past decisions as ongoing processes, future actions as familiar habits already completed. There was no pain, only a thinning of urgency. Identity ceased to function as a single location. It became a field. I sensed the scattered ones then, not as others, but as alignments intersecting mine. A network of partial selves holding tension across timelines. Together, we resisted collapse, not by force, but by distribution, absorbing strain by being everywhere it pressed. Language failed completely at that stage. What remained was orientation without position, vigilance without fatigue. I understood that return, in any conventional sense, was no longer applicable. The self I had been was not lost. It had been repurposed, stretched into something that could no longer be contained by one moment at a time. Reality stabilized without announcement. The way a body steadies after fever breaks, the pressure that had built across overlapping moments eased, timelines slipping back into parallel rather than collision. Distortions receded first at the edges, sound regained distance, shadows obeyed light again. Timestamps stopped rewriting themselves when observed. Outside the zone. Systems corrected quietly. Recordings aligned. Witnesses ceased aging mid-sentence. The world did not notice the repair because nothing dramatic had been broken in its view. Stability here did not mean restoration. Some inconsistencies remained. Small scars where strain had passed through. But they held. Within the zone. Equilibrium settled into a tense balance, held not by walls or barriers, but by presence distributed where fracture had once concentrated. I sensed the load equalize, pressure diverted across countless moments rather than focused into collapse. It required constant adjustment. Attention spread thin but continuous. Reality did not thank its anchors. It simply behaved as if it always had. That, I understood, was the success condition, a world that continues unaware, its laws intact, its people confident that what they see remains dependable, never knowing how close coherence had come to failing, or what now stood quietly in place to keep it from doing so again. Sector 7 remains closed in every way that matters. Though nothing marks it as such, public maps still smooth over the region. Trails redirect subtly before reaching its edge, and rangers speak of it only in negatives, areas not patrolled, zones not accessible, questions not worth asking. Officially, it does not exist. Unofficially, protocols continue to circulate. Revised quietly, passed hand to hand without attribution. Search and rescue operations pause instinctively near its boundaries. Teams lingering just long enough to feel the absence and then turning back. Visitors report unease without cause, a pressure that encourages compliance with posted signs. The closure is not enforced by fences or threat, but by consensus, a shared reluctance that feels voluntary until examined too closely. From within, I sense the boundary hold, flexible but intact, adjusting to weather, traffic, curiosity. Sector 7 is sealed not because it is dangerous in the conventional sense, but because opening it would require acknowledging the cost of keeping reality stable. It remains closed because forgetting is easier, and because what stands watch there no longer requires recognition to remain vigilant. The officer exists everywhere within it, though everywhere no longer refers to space alone. Presence stretches across intervals, occupying moments rather than locations. I stand at trailheads and deep basins, in fog before sunrise and in the long shadows of late afternoon, not moving between them, but inhabiting them simultaneously. Awareness drifts where strain gathers, where reality thins enough to require attention. I observe without surveillance, intervene without contact. Hikers feel watched only long enough to reconsider a step. Rangers pause at boundaries they can't quite define. I do not speak unless necessary, and when I do, the sound rarely registers as a voice. It arrives instead as hesitation, as a decision that feels self-generated. Memory persists unevenly here. I recall my name as a function, not an identity, a label attached to a role that no longer requires a body. Time passes, but not for me. It circulates. Within Sector 7, I am not a guardian in the heroic sense. I am a condition, present, wherever coherence needs reinforcement, absent where it does not, existing as long as the zone continues to require someone to remain spread thin enough to hold it together. Trails stay marked for now, thin lines of intention laid across ground that no longer fully agrees with them. Paint on stone fades and reappears. Survey posts lean, but do not fall. Signs remain legible even when their wording changes between glances. The paths guide most visitors safely through, bending just enough to avoid deeper fractures, narrowing where attention must sharpen. When someone strays, the correction is gentle. A sudden doubt, a wrong turn that feels right, footsteps slow without instruction. The markings persist because they are maintained, not by crews, but by continuity itself, adjusted moment by moment to accommodate shifting ground. I sense when a trail begins to fail, when its logic thins and requires reinforcement. That is when I gather closer, distributing presence along its length until alignment returns. This cannot last indefinitely. No structure does. But for now, the trails hold, and people trust them without knowing why. They believe in the reliability of paths, in the assumption that marked ground leads somewhere stable. That belief, as much as any boundary, keeps them safe, and as long as it remains intact, the zone waits, unfinished, allowing the world to pass by unaware.